Aaron Berkowitz back here with the Jewish Literary Journal with Josh Weiss, who is an author from South Jersey. Raised in a proud Jewish home, he was instilled with an appreciation for his cultural heritage from a very young age. Today, he is utterly fascinated with the convergence of Judaism and popular culture in film, television, comics, literature, and other media. His newest book, Sunset Empire, a Morris Baker novel, will be released by Grand Central Publishing on March 28th, 2023. Welcome, Josh. Thanks for coming back to
Of
speak with me.
course. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. I guess the first question is what inspired this book? It's the second in a series. So.
Yeah, I mean it's funny. I never intended to write a series. The first book was always at least at first intended as a one-off, but the more I thought about it, you know, the publisher and my agent kind of being like, "Oh, do you think you could turn this into a series?" So I started kind of brainstorming, and like many good ideas, the idea for this book came to me in the shower right before COVID, actually. And I got out. I was so excited. I texted my girlfriend, now wife, and my mom, be like, "I just figured out the story for the second book." And then it really went from there. And then, I mean, then the pandemic happened, and there was a lot. It was a slowdown, obviously. So I had some time to work on the first book and really kind of think about the second book. I mean, I really had some great. I had a lot of time, I should say, to think about the second book. And I would just, since there was nothing else to do during those early months of the pandemic, I would just go on walks here in Philadelphia, listening to music and just thinking, creatively. And then ideas would come to me as I'd go on these long walks, in the spring and summer of 2020. So that was really the genesis of it.
Yeah, I won't ask you who you texted first because I don't want to get you in trouble. Having a wife of my own, I know how that works. But did you find it sort of hard getting into a new story? Meaning, how do you keep it fresh without sort of bleeding into the material already covered in the first book?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. I mean, you're a writer yourself, you know how hard it can be to start anything. Like you finish, like the first book was a challenge in and of itself, and then I have to start on this whole new book, contractually obligated to deliver 100,000 words or whatever it is. So definitely challenging. I mean, for this book, the first book is very much about Morris Baker's experience during the Holocaust. We obviously get these flashes of him in the camps, working as a Sonderkommando, and I wanted the reader to I wanted that to be a mystery by itself, kind of discovering that in chunks as we go along in the story. But I knew we couldn't really do that for the second book, just because, I didn't want to kind of retread old material. So in this book, he's kind of haunted. He's still jaded and haunted by his past, but now he's flashing back to the events of the first book, and the people he lost or person. If you read the book, he's kind of guilty about losing Sophia, the fake Soviet agent. Spoiler alert, but the book's been out for a year. So, but he's feeling guilt about that, and he keeps flashing back to the climax at the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. And I just thought it would be interesting, instead of going into his past again, to try something new. But I still wanted him to, have these nightmares and be haunted by the people he has lost along the way. If that makes sense.
Yeah. How do you sort of think of flashback as a technique? There's a lot of, I think if you ask different writers, you'll get different sort of thoughts around flashback and its use. So obviously there's a trauma issue here of the Holocaust and how that sort of plays in. Do you consider that when you're thinking around the technique of flashback with this character?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a guy who, in this book, there's a moment where he's like a witness to every single unending tragedy in the world, something to that effect. He just, no matter what he does, no matter how much good he tries to put into the world, just he keeps getting thrown back at him. I don't know if I can curse on this podcast.
Yes.
You can edit that out. But he just keeps, this, like, no matter what he does, just tragedy follows him. And there's a great metaphor that if I do say so myself, just about how, it's like a diseased dog that won't leave him alone, and just following him. So it really is. Yeah, I just thought it would be interesting because also, like, these, like, in dreams, I could really get into my, like, Stephen King, John Carpenter horror influences where you couldn't necessarily do that in in real life. So these dream sequences are allow me to get a little bit of horror inspired, which was very fun.
Yeah, there is a sort of horror element, I would say, that crosses over with trauma, and sort of how that is both helpful and hurtful at the same time within sort of the dynamics between him and other characters and him and himself, in conflict. I think that it's interesting in the sense of, um, in some ways, the horror here sort of parlays off those fears from the first book. No, that the Holocaust itself sort of weaves its way into those horrors.
For sure. I mean, obviously that was like, I mean, growing up hearing about the Holocaust, it is a horror story. Like you cannot even fathom the, the just atrocities that occurred during that period of time. I mean, it is so far removed from the privileged existence that we have as American Jews, that yeah, it almost becomes like something out of Stephen King or something out of fiction. It does not feel real because you cannot wrap your head around that, and that really is, that goes back to the genesis of this character. Is just me trying to wrap my head around how would a person come out of the other side of the Holocaust, and you would not be a sane person, at least in my opinion. I mean, my grandfather was not the most loving or caring person in the world, so I just feel like it kind of you just have this warped sense of reality after that. You don't come back from oblivion.
Something in this book I thought that was a little different was there was more emphasis on sort of community and him trying to interact with other community members. Let's say, obviously he's a loner. I mean, it's sort of the genre of the thing is the loner type, but what sort of inspired that shift to him at least trying to be a part of a community?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. You hit the nail on the head there, because that was really the intention, was to really open up Morris Baker's world, have him start to interact with the wider Jewish community of Los Angeles in a way. Because at the end of the first book, we meet, Rabbi Kahn, who basically who had gone through the same thing as him and still believes in God, is still a practicing Jew. So I wanted at least Baker to have some kind of belief, or, get some of his faith back. But this is kind of him, even because in the first book he's so alone, he cuts himself off from everyone. Here I wanted him to interact with more Jews, which gave me an opportunity to add more Jewish elements, which is never a bad thing in my opinion. So yeah, it was really just about it's about community and family. I guess community and family are some of the big themes, identity as well. If you've read the book, I won't spoil anything, but yeah, community, family, identity are probably the biggest motifs throughout this novel.
On that note, sort of, how do I was once in a lecture, I think it was about Irish poetry, and the presenter was like trying to explain Irish language, and the question was asked of him, why do you think that the poet used the Irish language and didn't obviously they were bilingual, so why use that language? And he was sort of a Jewish concept, Hamaven Yavin, those who understand will understand and those who don't won't. So how do you sort of balance introducing perhaps a more Jewish identity in this book almost, for a larger publisher who's perhaps Gentile, or at least the audience is primarily Gentile? So how do you sort of balance that consideration when writing more Jewish topics or characters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I ask that a lot myself when I'm interviewing writers or directors who do Jewish television shows or films. Like, I'm like, were you ever worried that nobody would understand these more kind of idiosyncratic elements? I think if you trust your audience enough, if you give enough context, the audience will buy into it. For this book, there is a lot of explanation, just, saying in the Jewish tradition, whatever, this means this. But it's a good question, because some people will get it, some people won't. So I don't know, I guess as long as you create a strong context around it, you don't always have to explain concepts. Jewish concepts are explained in this book, Jewish traditions and whatnot. But I think the Yiddish Policemen's Union, even reading that as a Jewish person, I don't speak fluent Yiddish. So like the way Michael Chabon wrote that, just being so, trusting of his audience, creating this modern culture based around Yiddish. You may not always get it, but you'll understand. Yeah, I don't know. It is a tightrope.
To me, it seems like there is a ring of authenticity that allows for translation that is not literal, but at least you understand sort of the intention behind it, even if you don't understand exactly what's going on within a literal language or a ritual set. That there is some sort of, as you were saying, if you set up the context correctly, then it allows the reader to enter it, even if they don't fully grasp all aspects of whatever you're doing. I
Right,
don't
exactly.
that way, but
Yeah, that's perfectly put. You should. I should be interviewing you, Aaron.
no, I think maybe one day if a book comes out, then we can switch hats. But I'm also thinking around sort of the historicity of the book, if that, I think that's a term. I think that exists somewhere.
Sounds right.
Is there like a research element to it? Obviously you're writing in an alternate time and space, but also in history itself. So how much sort of consideration of historical fact is taken into the process?
Yeah, I mean that's a question I get asked a lot, and it's just, I mean, it's really the answer comes down to it's just a lot of Google searches, a lot of just basing it off of the kind of the pop culture that I know from that period. So kind of building it off, this character is based off an impression of my grandfather. It's not a one-to-one translation of the person. So it's kind of just, like I said, I've never lived in Los Angeles. I've been there 3 times, 2 times in my life. I can't even remember, but it's a lot of Google image, Google Maps and Street View, and just this is sort of this is all about this romanticized noir genre. This is my romanticized uh, vision of Los Angeles in this time period, and I think obviously you want some historical background and foundation. You don't want to just go completely off the rails, but um, I think the more you get into the weeds, I find myself kind of being like, should I be super faithful to this event or what this person would do or something like? But then it's alternate history. You have to remember, think this is a work of fiction in the end. So there are I have a whole for this book. I have a whole document of links and whatnot that I used. Um, so yeah, it's really again a balancing act of just having that foundation, but also realizing that you don't need to stick to the facts 100%.
And there seems to be like a three-pronged sort of, in your bio, you talk about the intersection of Judaism and culture. So there's almost to me like three aspects of that. There's Jews within culture, Jews who create culture, and the culture of Jews themselves. So I mean, I don't know. It seems like you're talking about sort of your cultural references within that time period. Do you sort of think around those aspects of culture within Judaism, or how Judaism and culture interact, or sort of where do you put the emphasis on those things?
That's a good question. I have to think on that. That's a really good question, actually. Um, yeah, I mean, it's just like whenever I see Jewish culture, religion, or whatever in media, like I start to geek out. It doesn't matter if it's a good or bad. Like if the product, it's like if the depiction of Judaism or Jews is negative, obviously that's problematic. But if I see something that at least is trying to show Judaism or Jews in a kind of more respectful way, trying to kind of dig deeper, is when I really start to geek out, because you just don't see that in mainstream. I mean, I just watched a movie called The Offering, about a ultra Orthodox guy who comes back to his father's Jewish funeral home in Borough Park, um, and I recommend it. It was fun, but yeah, I mean, sorry, what was the?
No, just sort of
Am I
had
getting away from
balancing.
the
No,
question?
no, no. I think you're still on topic. Just balancing sort of the idea of culture of Jews versus Jews' impact on culture versus um, culture around Jews, like how other people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everything. It's just eh, you've stumped me, but yeah, I think it's just every kind of facet that you could think of is just like if there is something kind of the more esoteric elements of Judaism is what I really like seeing in fiction. So learning more about Kabbalistic supernatural stuff, and the more kind of the more nitty gritty um, elements that most people probably wouldn't know. So because you grow up 18 years of Jewish day school, this stuff is like ingrained in your head, and then you see it. You come from such a small community, and then you see it in the mainstream. It's very exciting. I don't know if that answered the question, but
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is. It's always a complex sort of dance, to me at least, sort of how much, in some ways, it's almost like revealing family secrets in literature. That there's sort of like a, within Judy, especially with like things like Kabbalah or whatever, right? You're not supposed to learn it until you're 40. You have to have a beard. You can't share it with other people. So there is sort of like an element of secrecy even within the Jewish religious ethic, let's call it, of hiding. But it always is interesting to see what bleeds through or what people choose to allow others to, what you share of your own culture within a work. That seems to me like sort of I also where I would geek out, where you're sort of like, oh, this person really like thought about it, considered it, and then put it in a way that makes sense even for an outside context.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of the work, obviously there's been different works coming out recently of Jewish identity and sort of what that looks like. I don't know, it's always a fascinating topic, even sort of like what is a Jew and how does the world perceive that sort of identity. I don't know. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for either for the question per se. It's just an interesting question to me, sort of around how we present ourselves and how then we are interpreted. It's also interesting in sort of the way that this is a genre book, but you're also trying to revitalize it in a way with the Judaism aspect, I would say, more than perhaps other things. Do you subscribe to like genre? Do you think of your book as fitting into, the mystery genre, let's call it, or the detective genre or noir genre? Like, how do you sort of see your work?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think it falls under a number of different genres and descriptors. I mean, yeah, mystery, crime, noir, obviously hard-boiled fiction and film noir being the biggest influences. But yeah, I mean, it's the Jewish element. I think is something that, at least in like the early buzz that we've been getting, it's been positive. Is that this is like you don't often find a guilty Jewish person detective. So that I'm proud of him. I think that was sort of my way in personally. Is they say write what you know. So if I'm going to write a character, might as well make him a Jewish person with all this tradition, all this baggage, and who does guilt better than the Jews? So
Yeah, it's an interesting sociological phenomenon, perhaps, of like the Jew as hero or anti-hero, perhaps in this case, is not something that I don't think is the narrative, perhaps even that Jews subscribe to necessarily. In some ways, I think because of the way we tell our own history, I don't know how often we think of ourselves as hero or anti-hero, or at least hero in a, let's say a westernized version of hero manner.
yeah, and it's just this. I think it kind of plays into the old comic book tradition of of Jack Kirby and Joe Simon having Captain America punch Hitler. All the way back in 1941, there is kind of, especially after the Holocaust, at least, there is the kind of this desire to kind of take back that power and to portray Jews as powerful and not, as these kind of, I guess, superhero type figures. But yeah, it definitely plays into the kind of that tough Jew, Inglorious Bastards type of paradigm of just wanting to see badass Jews. Obviously you could be flawed. Doesn't mean he's a flawed person, but he's a Jew and he went through this horrible experience, and he says, I'm never going to allow people to treat me like this again.
Yeah, I don't want to. We can cut this if it ruins something. I don't want to ruin anything. I'm not going to reveal anything, but perhaps hopefully this is not a surprise per se. But in terms of the genre of noir or whatever genre we want to call it, there is always the pressure of the twist. So how do you think of the twist first? Do you think the twist last? Do you like how do you sort of deal with the pressure of that turn?
Yeah, I think I think the twist came first, and then I had to build the whole story around that. I definitely wrote the epilogue. The epilogue was the very first thing I wrote before I started writing the book in earnest, because it was just so clear in my mind. Um, so it's just kind of funny how, as a writer, there are certain things that are more vivid in your mind, and that's kind of something that if I'm having trouble writing one section of a book, I'll go to this other section that I really, really am excited to write and have a really kind of strong vision for. So yeah, I'd say like the overall twist and like overarching, explanation for the overarching conflict is the first thing that came to me in the shower, 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. They say if you're in a teaching setting, they say start with the end in mind. I've always found that hard within writing, But I remember every once in a while you start with something, you go somewhere, and you realize at the end is actually the beginning. I don't know. It's a weird phenomenon where um, sometimes you think you've gotten somewhere, and really that's just the opening sort of uh, thing to the work in its
Right.
reality.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the way
Um,
in sometimes.
yeah. Talk to me. This is on a different note, but talk to me about like a second book versus a first book. Like, what's the difference in process from a technical? Is it you just talk to your agent, they talk to the publisher? Is it the same sort of struggle to get the second book as it is the first?
I mean, I was lucky enough that this was a 2 book deal, so that was always second book was always in the cards. Shout out to my agent Scott Miller, Trident Media Group. Dude's awesome. Um, yeah, I mean, so I can't. I mean, I can't speak for obviously that's not the universal experience, but it was a 2 book deal, so I was contractually obligated to deliver a second book. So when you're being paid to write something, the first book I wrote on my own before I started sending it out to agents. So the second book was there's a little more pressure, but um, I like that. As a journalist and writer, I work a little bit better under pressure. So and having a deadline and knowing that I have to deliver, other than just following my own goalposts. So yeah, it was. There are pros and cons. I mean, it really. I think this one was written. The second book was written in a much shorter time frame, as is the case with when you're working on a deadline for a novel. I think they said like 9 months is like the average amount of time. That's about how much. That's about how long it took. Um, so yeah, I mean, I tried to do like 1,000 words a day. And if you don't hit that, that's fine. But that was sort of my goal every day, and you have to write, every night or during the day or on weekends, whatever it is. But you just have to discipline yourself to get the words on the page.
Yeah, that I suppose that's sometimes the trouble with it all is getting those words out. But I think that also with this book that um, do we think that there's, I guess the next question would be more, is there a third one coming, do you think? Or how do you feel about, or you're sort of like, I think I did too, I was contractually obligated, and what's sort of the impression you feel?
I'll just say there are discussions. Nothing, nothing definite to lock to confirm just now. I mean, there are ideas. I have 50 pages on Google Docs of book ideas. So I know where the third book would go. Hopefully we can go there, or I have ideas for other books. Maybe I'll do another book and then come back to this character. Who knows? Nothing to confirm yet, but there are multiple balls in the air.
All right. I think that, as we sort of wrap up here, where can they find this book and your work in general? How can they keep, get in touch, or I guess up to date with whatever's going on?
Yeah, so you can get the book from Grand Central Publishing. I'm not sure when this will run, but it'll be out March 28th, 2023. Get it wherever fine books are sold, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, other outlets. Um, and you can follow me on Twitter if you'd like, Joshua H. Weiss. Same handle on Instagram. Not that I'm super interesting on social media, but yeah, just pick up the book and I hope you enjoy it.